Hello. The intelligence community has an extent of consciousness, as do networks, that they use people like Adam Mockler to make allegations against others and to change and fake what people say, with them also changing and faking, which actually digitally recorded and over phones. And police departments have been, not just Weathersfield Police, but Weathersfield Police did this when I was a kid and then as an adult. And I was with people with multiple police departments and the FBI, former director of the FBI, Robert Luskin, his co-defendants and their family members, involved also with other natures of organized crimes, and has nothing to do with that case. That part of a case in 2006, they brought it up though. So they brought it in, though, and with the roles with Fox Connecticut News, and next to it, they have a Mike Domain, and they have an Eric Mendez, and his older brother faked conversations. I never had a word of conversation with him. And at the Weathersfield police station, he faked conversations with me. I never had a class with him either. He walked by me one time in school. That's how I remember what he looked like. Like one or two times he walked by me. Someone else, I learned his name from someone else. In other words, these are people involved with former director of the FBI, directly and indirectly, with World Trade Center predicate acts from Connecticut. These are Connecticut campuses, rolls with this. And prisons. These are people out of the state corrections offices and out of the state judicial branch offices, with child abusers, leaders of kids first forced years apart too, and the ones that were involved with it years ago and pretending other. So all kinds of things pretending and while pretending other. They were then, as adults, roles with the other one. They put fake people, fake ties, fake nature ties to me with the news, multiple news locations, the interbranch forging, switching names, still refusing to get onto paper. Increasingly, it's their roles threaten me not to say what I caught them doing. Intercities before the World Trade Center attack with the families of the Britain Superior Court and of Hartford courts, with an Eric Burgess, and with other people intercities with them next to campuses, not campuses, with a Dean Judd, his kid. In other words, other deans, intercampuses involved. So they have all kinds of natures of organized crimes with the names of the people of the sciences. Where and how forgiveness is important because that country's A through Z. The names of the people of sciences have criminally foreign influence, tactical delusions, wrought, quality aspects of fact, cheap nature, based on what they've been doing, replacing, for example, what our founders declassified for their communications. But even though that's known, people don't know it because the experts on American history, instead have their words self-valued while being their syntax and their natures are being and have been used remotely, criminally foreign influence, tactically, delusions, wrought, while pretending other to screen a whole bunch of things for themselves because the breaching method does that. So they can't even discern itself themselves. In other words, there was a breaching method sustained with northern colonies and southern colonies before the Civil War because James Madison and the founders behind him and his plan before the presidents, they didn't have means, but the only plan they had, the only means they had was to counter extort and force people to become a union, to become a country. And that's the plan they used. And so they first counter extorted George Washington, and he agreed to help them and to use that plan. And then they counter extorted the rest of the key people and locations. They had to counter extort them because everyone was questioned. There were questions and answers, and the law had collusions with overt criminal enterprises, private ones, terrorists, and things that they didn't even want collusions with. But they had self-valued rules because they don't even think about it to that extent. And if they did and tried to speak about it, they would have been sentenced, including if it has a majority of people, including if it has everyone from the whole country. And that would easily be adapted to by the breaching method that was there since before modern religious messengers were born. It already had roles from off the campuses, but then on off them hyper-additional collusions with itself. only allowed to be. And then it maintained that and showed the people that rolls with it, they have to hide that too, because nature's continually demonstrating it to it. Nature continually demonstrates to us. One of the things that is true always about the witch trials, the crazy things that we're all at once. Like witch trial, there's a witch trials place next to Webb House, now renamed the Webb Stevens Museum. And then now still they have other communicators for James Madison and for the founders, plural, behind him and his plan. That which enabled the leverage for George Washington to be able to counter extort people, northern colonies and southern colonies that were the possession of more than one country, and overt criminal enterprises, private ones, terrorists, originally and still for a breaching of hyper foreign, even worse than all that together, grouped and individually, has all humanity voicings through an our system's tactical ulterior, from the one that communicates with human species, individual body of individual bodies, with all group differences generated, where and how we could discern its body to an extent, that which is generating other species bodies of individual bodies and all group differences too. So we could discern that. Black people's peer. So in other words, they have people, they're not supposed to make allegations. They do worse than that. They still have child abusers, leaders of kids forest. And these are some sick fakes right through administrations, the Republican themed and the Democrat themed, where and how it counts. That's why in other words, you have to get them on paper. They're putting fake transcripts in databases, the interbranch. Where does this Leahy family live? Who knows the Leahy family? They're involved with some bad things and fake conversations with little kids and adults, with a whole bunch of people. Get them on paper with the prosecutors. There's a Brian Silver too, recorded confessed to Mr. Caprem. A Rick Simpaglione. I never had class with him in grammar school. And then the middle school teacher, I had no conversation with him there. That middle school teacher, Mr. Neville, and his people tied to a Mr. Neville all along Route 3 and its conjunctions, and like the state judicial branch offices, has rules with people putting identity theft, fraud, slanders, and delusions into the record. And he stole my poem, that guy. That guy has a bunch of people, like I don't know, Matt Olson, Eric Olson, Eric Jensen, other people have them with the state police and with a whole bunch of people tied to a Ray Colo and a Eric Oliveri. A bunch of people tied to Eric, my neighbors sought me out as strangers to make confessions to me. I don't even know them. Then they're trying to put me tied to them. I never saw Joe. I never hung around with Ray Colo and Paul Zano. By the way, they tried to after my grade graduated. In other words, these are people with Washington D.C. too. Why I stayed back for the people, the students and the teachers all along Route 175 from Old Weathersfield are people who've been planting evidences. Has something to do with their roles in Washington D.C. Has something /s. It has something generating all these other negative value nature progressions, acts, and natures, and denials of them when all we have to do is address them. No, I just did a video on, people are still speaking about white supremacy, pretending not to realize they have our founders' communications replaced about how the suburbs were designed tactically denatured, and they wanted to build better, safer, and an identity of the ground's identity relationship to itself that could cause evolution's fruits, gifts, means out of nowhere back then, let alone now. Now people have been on, in other words, you guys were raised with criminally foreign influence takes on American history, and the law identities leaned on that. They use our founders' words, leaving out what they declassified, and then even as a president too. Even once he was a president, also James Madison, he still didn't have free speech. This is declassified. James Madison's plan forced the Civil War. James Madison's plan made a unity between Native Americans and colonists and regular citizens and Native Americans. No, already, so before Columbus sailed the ocean blue, already Native Americans, there are proofs they weren't called Native Americans, but the humanity that was native here were already fighting with themselves because the same breaching method did this. It did things to force people to respond to what it did, and then having to blame other things, others ourselves incorrectly, and to defend that. And then those people had to counter that and then defend that, leaving out the breaching method. And it propagated that. It propagated roles with that self-cultivated. And while there are roles with that active now, those are roles increasingly valuing as having been. You guys are still speaking about white supremacy because you guys are collusions at campuses, campuses A through Z. The breaching method shows the educators they need to keep things blamed on the kids' parents, etc. In other words, when it's their fault. There's not real science speaking for the suburbs, let alone, and they were designed to unfold too as suburban/urban, like Hartford, Connecticut, and then straight up urban, designed through ourselves. That was entrenched. There was internationally monitored conversations. People weren't even allowed to have been heard. I mean, weren't even allowed to hear people speaking about building infrastructure outside of internationally monitored conversations and not telling on that. But that was also timed collusion /S with overt criminal enterprises, private ones, and terrorists. What are witch trials about? You don't leave out those crazy laws against our own buried black pupils and white survivors and communicating other for nature with it. And our founders communicated about that too. Our founders communicated for us to blame the human factory nature breaching method. You guys have the breaching method replaced right from the communications of our founders declassified for us. You guys have self-valued roles with uses of their words. And our founders is distinct from our presidents. Our presidents were counter-extorted. That's why slavery stood. Any court that or anyone who's voting on slavery, they have problems with the readings of the law. Slavery is not something you vote on. If you know how to speak for the Constitution on a bridge, exceptions and exception nature. People aren't supposed to be making allegations. And if people are guilty of, say people are charged guilty, but there's some mistake or something, they're supposed to hide that. In other words, I'm not supposed to hide collusions too, because all sides of criminal and civil cases and the breaching method and overt criminal enterprises, terrorists, when did they stop having the difference of guilt used by the breaching method to hide its roles with all those names? All kinds of negative value nature, progressions, acts, natures. It propagated black pupils. Yeah.